Well, as someone might say, you of all people are most blessed because you've made it. You have come to the end, to the final book of our study in understanding the Old Testament. We began at Genesis. I didn't look up the date when we started Genesis, but we started Genesis a while ago, and we have finally come to the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi. And so if you want, you can give yourselves a pat on the back or whatever to congratulate yourselves for being the ones that have come to the end of this study. So if you haven't already turned there in your Bibles, let's go to Malachi so that we can get started and continue to complete what it is that we started out to do just a little while ago. Or by way of introduction, let's talk about Malachi in this way. This is the book that contains the Lord's last recorded words of Old Testament times. Okay, so after Malachi is done, basically this is what happens. The Lord doesn't say anything through any prophets now until about 400 years after. Okay, so this is kind of the last words that God is going to say to the people of Malachi, and that's why we would say in many respects that Malachi is a sad book. The reason why we say that is because it reveals what little progress, really, if any, Israel has made since the nation was born 1,500 years previous. You take a look at the birth of the nation 1,500 years earlier, you take a look at the nation and its state as we find it in Malachi, and there really isn't a lot of difference over that time. And so that's why in some respects, in many respects, it's regarded as a sad book, but as dark and distressing as that is, we still find, as somebody has said, the Son of God's grace. And Son is spelled correctly there. We're not S-O-N, we're talking about S-U-N. The Son of God's grace arises out of its pages. So when the reader has arrived at the last verses, there's really no question but that in the end, the day of glory will come for repentant Israel, as it will for all believers. And that's how Malachi ends. He ends on a positive note, the fact that God isn't finished with you yet. He still has work to do. But again, these are going to be the last words that God speaks through his prophets until the coming of Messiah, or we should say 6 months prior to the coming of Messiah, because we know that the angel of the Lord came and talked with Elizabeth. But before he talked to Elizabeth, he talked with Zechariah, her husband, with regard to the birth of John the Baptist, which, by the way, Malachi talks about in his book. All right? And so it's a connection that we can make between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. So let's take this book, let's outline it as we have with the others. 4 chapters in this short book, but we're going to divide it up into 3 categories so that that kind of gives you an easy way of working it through. The first 5 verses of chapter 1, what Malachi talks about is the privilege of the nation. The fact that they are a privileged people, a special people, and the privilege that they have had as God's people and the things that he has done for them. But by the time we get into verse 6 and Malachi takes us through to verse 15 of chapter 3, he then talks about the pollution, what we would call the pollution of the nation. What is wrong with the nation? What is taking place in their midst? The sins that they are struggling with, the ways in which they are rebelling against God. That takes up the majority of Malachi's book, and we'll talk a little bit later about the pattern of how he shares those problems that they are having as a people. But, of course, Malachi closes with the promise to the nation, right? Not his promise, but God's promise. That God will work in them. He will work through them. There will come a time when he will restore the things that need to be restored. That's the promise that Malachi gives. And that's why we say that as dark and as sad as maybe Malachi is, he does end his book on a high note, per se, with regard to the promises of God. So, 4 chapters. We've divided it up into 3 sections, and I would encourage you, if you read the book this week, which shouldn't be hard, only 4 chapters, you can get it done before Christmas, I guarantee you. It would be a case if you keep that outline tight to your side there. As you read, you'll be able to see how all of that is coming together. So, as we've done before, let's talk about some background with regard to this book. We'll deal with Malachi first. And here is another one of those books where we really don't know anything about Malachi. We're not furnished with any biographical information other than what we find in verse 1 of chapter 1. It says, "The burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi." That's really all we know. He was a prophet of God. And by the dating of the book and how we will work that through, we also know that he was a contemporary of Nehemiah. Okay, so this begins to give us a little bit of an idea as to where we fit Malachi into all of the history of Israel. Remember, Nehemiah was the one that came back to help rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Prior to that was the temple rebuilding project, remember, under the leadership of Ezra. So Malachi was ministering during Nehemiah's time, and we know, if we remember our study of Nehemiah, that there were some significant things that the people were doing that needed to be corrected. Nehemiah was one of the ones that talked about that, but Malachi was also one who talked about it as well. As far as what his name means, it's the abbreviated form of Malachi. So Malachi is the abbreviated form of Malachi, and his name means messenger of Jehovah. All right? Seems appropriate, since that's indeed what Malachi was doing. He was God's messenger to the people as they were coming through this time period. It's also interesting to note that, again, just 4 chapters in this book, remember, so it is a small book. That's why we call it a minor prophet. The word messenger itself appears 3 times in this book. Okay? So, as you read through, find the word messenger. You'll see it 3 times in your text, and that's interesting that that happens, since what does Malachi's name mean? Messenger of Jehovah. All right? So it seems to be something important that we need to know. As far as Malachi is concerned and what we know about him, that's it. That's all there is. So when we get to heaven, when that time comes, we'll be able to sit down with Malachi and be able to find out all the things that we didn't know about him, because it was revealed to us in the Scriptures, but he'll be able to tell us all about himself when we get to eternity, and we'll have all of eternity to hear the stories that he would have. So that's Malachi himself. Let's talk now about his book, okay? And some background information there. And let's begin with the date. We've already talked about Malachi being a contemporary of Nehemiah. And we figured that he probably wrote his book around the time of Nehemiah's visit to Babylon in 433. Okay, so that kind of gives us a date there. We're not going to take time to go back into Nehemiah chapter 13. But chapter 13 of Nehemiah is the last chapter, okay? And after Nehemiah completes his rebuilding project, he does return to Babylon for a time. And this is when we figure that Malachi probably wrote his book. And the reason why we think that is because there are 3 facts that are shared with us as we look at Malachi itself. First of all, we know this, that the temple project had already been completed, okay? And Mosaic sacrifices were being offered by the time that Malachi is writing. Notice verse 7 of chapter 1. Notice what God says through the prophets. You offer defiled food on my altar. Okay, so we're talking about the sacrifices, right? You offer defiled food on my altar, but you say, in what way have we defiled you? By saying the table of the Lord is contemptible. And when you offer the blind as a sacrifice, is it not evil? Now the blind here is the animals which would be blind. Okay? Remember in the Old Testament law, sacrifices, animal sacrifices, the animals were to be in perfect shape, right? And God is accusing them and and helping them to understand what's wrong with their sacrifices. Again, verse 8, and when you offer the blind as a sacrifice, is it not evil? And when you offer the lame and sick, is it not evil? Offer it then to your governor. Would he be pleased with you? Would he accept you favorably? Says the Lord of hosts. Of course, we know the answer to the question, that he wouldn't accept that. But now entreat God's favor, that he may be gracious to us. While this is being done by your hands, will he accept you favorably, says the Lord of hosts. Who is there even among you who would shut the doors so that you would not kindle fire on my altar in vain? I have no pleasure in you, says the Lord of hosts, nor will I accept an offering from your hands. So we see here a little bit of detail with regard to what's happening. We know the temple project is already completed because the Mosaic sacrifices are indeed taking place. If you go up to chapter 3 and verse 1, notice again what God says. Behold, I send my messenger. So there's that word again. Remember I said it was occurred 3 times in the book. And he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight. Behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. Skip down to verse 8. Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, in what way have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. Again, part of the Mosaic law and the exercise of the Mosaic law. All right? So this is one of the ways in which we know when Malachi wrote his book, the temple project had been completed. They were involved in following the law, lip service more than anything else, unfortunately, but they were involved in following the law, offering those sacrifices. Also, we know that the Persian governor, not Nehemiah, because he had returned back to Babylon, okay? So it was the Persian governor who was ruling the Jews at this time. Again, we see that in verse 8 of chapter 1, where Malachi says, as God encourages him, offer it then to your governor, he says, right? And so, yeah, the Persian governor is the one that rules the people at this point. And another fact that we know is this. The sins that were denounced by Malachi in his book were the same type of sins that Nehemiah dealt with during his second term. What were those sins? One of them was the laxity and the corruption of the priests. They were there, they were exercising what they were doing, but it was all lip service. There was no passion in it. There was no significance in it. It was just all lip service. And the priests were responsible for that. Nehemiah had to deal with the same thing when he was there. Another sin that they were dealing with was mixed marriages. Remember in Nehemiah chapter 13, that last chapter, Nehemiah has to deal with the mixed marriages of the Jewish people. What we mean by mixed marriages there is that the Jewish men were marrying non-Jewish women, okay? The Old Testament law was very clear. A Jewish man was to marry a Jewish woman. There was not to be a mix of the races. But what was happening was that these mixed marriages were taking place. And Nehemiah had to deal with that. And guess what? Malachi denounces the same problem. Another thing that they're working through as well is the neglect of the tithe. Again, the Old Testament law required that a tenth of all that came in was to be the first fruits, or that which was given to God first, before anything else happened with whatever came in from your crops and your animals and your herds. Nehemiah was having again to deal with the same problem when he wrote about it in the book of Nehemiah. So, because of the similarities, and they're talking about the same sins, that's why we understand and know that Malachi wrote his book during or after Nehemiah's time in Jerusalem, when the rebuilding projects were done. So that helps us to understand the time period in which Malachi was writing. Let's then talk about occasion for writing. Let's talk about the message that he was writing. And to give us a little bit of a time factor here, let's note this. When Malachi wrote his book, the Jews as a nation had been back in the land of Canaan for about 100 years. Okay? So that gives you kind of a time span that has taken place. So we're talking about a period long enough to have reestablished themselves in the nation, especially in the city of Jerusalem, to reestablish all of what they had forgotten or had left behind when they were in captivity. And we can't blame what's going on to the factor of it being a new generation that didn't know any better. No, we're talking about a reestablished nation back in Jerusalem. They've been there for about 100 years. And prophets like Haggai and Zechariah, we're familiar with these guys now because we've already worked through their books. What Haggai and Zechariah had predicted was this, that God's blessings would be given to the people in the days to come. Especially, remember, in the day of the Lord, that special phrase that they would use, okay? So as these prophets were predicting and giving out these messages, what had happened is that several decades had passed, right? Again, remember, they've been back in the land for about 100 years now. So for decades, these messages that Haggai and Zechariah had passed by, and these prophecies of hope that they talked about, this day of the Lord that they had talked about, had not been fulfilled. Okay? Well, you know what happens when you're promised something, right? And then you wait for it to be fulfilled. And the longer you wait, the doubt quotient with regard to that promise continues and begins to rise, right? Same thing is happening here. Okay? Haggai and Zechariah made these promises about the day of the Lord, and nothing has happened to fulfill these. And so, as far as the people, as they have returned back to the land of Canaan, the days that they're living in become increasingly drab and dreary. Yes, I remember what Haggai said. Yes, I remember what Zechariah said, but nothing's happening. I wonder if anything is going to happen, right? We can, I think, perhaps identify with them. So what's happening then is that during this period of what we would call disappointment, disillusionment, and discouragement, how's that for alliteration for you, right? What happens is they have nothing but broken hearts and blasted hopes, okay? They basically come to the point now where they're not sure whether or not God even cares or even knows, okay? We found ourselves in the same spot, right? As we have been waiting. Imagine waiting generations. Imagine waiting decades. And this is where they find themselves. And so, with their faith and their worship eroding, what happened is that their daily lives showed it. You cannot hide it forever. You might be able to put up a good front for now, but the longer you go, the less you'll be able to hide it. And so what the nation does is it falls into what we call a backslidden condition. They were hypercritical of God's ways, especially when Malachi was giving the message he was giving. Because of their hypercriticism, they would say, oh yeah, Malachi, we've heard all of this before. Okay? Why would you think we should believe you after what all we've heard and nothing is happening, nothing is taking place? And for even God to speak with them, even in their attitude that they have right now, is evidence again of God's long suffering and evidence again of His mercy. We see the same kind of message given by Peter in his epistle. Remember when he says, the people are saying, everything is the same as since the days of old. This God that you're talking about and His judgment is coming. Nothing has happened. Nothing's changed from generations ago. Why should we believe you now? And what is Peter's response to that? What you have to understand is the reason why nothing has happened for such a long time is because God is merciful. And God is not, as Peter says, God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to righteousness. He's waiting, He's merciful, He's gracious, He's giving you as much time as you need to get yourself turned around. And Malachi would have had the same messages as well. In fact, the main subjects of Malachi's message are where he talks about the love of God. He talks about the priests and the people and the sin that they're involved in. He talks about God's judgment for sin, and as well as judgment for sin, the blessing for righteousness that comes when we become obedient people. We can't help but observe, when we take a look at Malachi itself, we cannot help but observe that the gospel of God has been the same message for people for generations, right? Remember when we took a look at all of the other minor and major prophets, and the same kind of message came across, right? And the fact that God wants to deal with you, but you have to be willing to turn to Him. God wants to deal with you either way. If you don't turn to Him, He will deal with you in this way. If you do turn to him, then he promises to deal with you in this way. He promises to bless you. But if he does not bless you, he will judge you. Malachi is saying the exact same thing. Okay? So this message has been consistent through all of what has taken place, and Malachi is no exception in that message. But what's interesting about Malachi and the way in which he speaks and the way in which it is written down for us is that there are some particular features here in Malachi's prophetic book that are different from the others that we have been looking at. Again, the most notable feature of Malachi's book is what we call its repeated pattern of discourse. To help you see this, let's go to Malachi chapter 3. All right? Let's go to Malachi chapter 3, and we'll see an instance where we have this pattern of discourse shown to us, and you'll find as you go through Malachi that this pattern, the way in which Malachi speaks, the way in which he writes, is repeated throughout the book. Okay? So, basically, as Malachi talks about what he's going to talk about, he has 3 steps that are involved in his discourse, this pattern of discourse that he has. The first step is this, where he brings in affirmation, or another word that we could use here is some type of charge or accusation. And he does this vividly. Notice again verse 8. Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. There's the charge. There's the accusation. There's no beating around the bush about it. He brings it and declares it straight and clear. We have that first step. After the affirmation, then we have what we call interrogation. And we always see this because it's introduced by the phrase, you say. But you say, how have we robbed you? Again, go back to verse 8 of chapter 3. Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. There's the accusation, or the affirmation, or the charge. But you say, so here we go. There's the next step, right? The interrogation. But you say, in what way have we robbed you? Okay? The question. So it's kind of like this. Malachi goes, you're doing this. And the people are going, what do you mean? How are we doing that? Right? So there's that second step, which then takes us to the third step of refutation, where there is now an answer to the question. How can you accuse us of this? Here's how we can accuse you of it. Notice again when we go back to verse 8. Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. There's the accusation or the charge. But you say, in what ways have we robbed you? There's the interrogation. Then we get into the third step, where you have the refutation, in tithes and offerings. That's how they're robbing you. Okay? You'll find that same pattern repeated throughout the book of Malachi. And so if you take the time to read it this week, take a look for it. Notice those times where that pattern of discourse is given. It's not just in here in verse 8, but it's basically in chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. All right? As you take a look at it, look for it as you're going through it. In fact, the common repeated phrase, and again, in all of these discourses, again, is that phrase, you say. How often is it repeated? It appears 8 times. It appears 8 times in the book. Okay? If there's only 4 chapters, then it's got to be at least twice in each chapter. It's more than that, because chapter 4 does not necessarily have that phrase. Another feature of Malachi's message is this. His message is strong on emphasizing the law of God. Notice verse 4 of chapter 4. Remember the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel with the statutes and judgments. When God is talking through Malachi about Horeb, what's the location that he's referring to? Just so that we're clear here. Do you know what Mount Horeb was? What another name for Mount Horeb was?
Sinai.
Yes, Mount Sinai. Remember where Moses received the law from God? On Mount Sinai. Mount Horeb is a different name, but the same location. Okay? So, notice the emphasis that Malachi has on the law of God. Also, we find another feature of this book is that it surpasses all other prophetic books in the proportion of verses that are spoken by the Lord to Israel. Out of the 55 verses total, where God speaks to Israel, 47 of them talk about God speaking to Israel directly. Okay? So we have an emphasis here that is quite clear. So, we've told you all that we know about Malachi, but here's some interesting factors about the book of Malachi itself. Particular comments or questions that perhaps you have as we pause here for a moment or two and before we carry on.
I guess I'm amazed at how much we don't change.
In what way? Can you expand on that a little?
We still do the same things over and over and over. There's no change, you know. It's easy to say, well, look what they did, but, you know, we do the same thing.
Right.
You know, we get the same results. And we question and argue with God. You know.
How can you say that? How, you mean it's me that's responsible for that? You know, the same kind of things, right? Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments? All right then. Pardon me. Let's talk a little bit about the place of Malachi in the biblical canon. Again, let's remember, in our English Bibles in the Old Testament, okay, we've put Malachi as the final book. Okay? If you were to go to the Hebrew Old Testament, you would find that the last book is the Chronicles. Okay? Reason why they do that is because the book of the Kings, which talks about the history, right, of the nation, not only its development under the kings of Saul and David and Solomon, and then the divided kingdom, but Chronicles repeats the same thing, only later. And so what happens in the Hebrew Bible is that the Kings and the Chronicles are here, and then all of the other books of the Old Testament are kind of in between, especially the prophets, right? Okay? What we've done in our English Bibles is we put Malachi at the very end. The reason why we've done that is because we see the significance of what this book is about. It's not only a conclusion, okay, a conclusion to the Old Testament. This is the last words of God to his people before he goes silent. Okay? But this book is also a connecting link. This is going to be the book that connects us into the New Testament. Specifically, as we talk not just about the Messiah who is to come. We already saw some glimpses of that. Go back to chapter 3. Verse 1. Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. Does that sound familiar? How is it familiar? Why is it familiar? What does it remind us of? Or who does it remind us of?
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist. What was his purpose for coming? He was to prepare the way of the Lord. So go back to the verse again. Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Even the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. Okay, so we have that word messenger again there. The messenger in verse 1, we would say is John the Baptist. Okay? Who is the messenger halfway through the verse when it says, even the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight? Who's the messenger there?
Jesus.
Yes. The Messiah, who is to come. Even the messenger of the covenant, remember when he was instituting the Lord's Supper, right? At the end of his earthly ministry, and he says, this is the new covenant in my blood, right? Notice what it says here. Will suddenly come to his temple. Even the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming. says the Lord. So Malachi is declaring that this Messiah who's been promised, he is still coming. And so what Malachi does for us is it concludes the story of Israel for the span of 2000 to 400 BC. So we're talking about 1600 years there, where Malachi concludes this 1600-year-old story. And again, it's going to be the last prophetic voice of the Old Testament, where he connects not just what has been happening in the Old Testament, but now, and we will see this when we start our study in the New Testament in the new year, what he does now is he connects the Old Testament with the New Testament, specifically by his prophecies of both John the Baptist and Christ's first advent. Malachi says, he is coming, referring to the first advent. We know that he is coming again. We see that in the New Testament, especially when we get to the last book of the New Testament. But Malachi, being the last book of the Old Testament, will talk about his first advent. So, beyond that, what the book does is it reaches into the end times with its prophecies about the final day of the Lord. And you'll find as you go through here that, Malachi just does not talk only about the first advent of Christ, but he also, especially when we get in chapter 4, will talk about the second advent of Christ as well. Okay? So that's what makes the book of Malachi rather significant. Really, Malachi is not the ending. Malachi is the transition piece. And that's the reason why we in our English Bibles have put Malachi as the final book of the Old Testament before we begin into the New Testament. Comments or questions there?
It makes me, I guess maybe more aware of, like you were saying, Nehemiah, Zechariah was the revelation book for the Old Testament.
Yes.
And you know, they weren't any more aware of what was coming than maybe we are, literally in that last time. You know, and how important it is to make people aware. You know, that
not only make people aware, but to be faithful ourselves, right? Yeah.
And to not be complacent.
Even though how many years have passed since, right, the birth of Christ and the death of Christ, right? And we're talking about, we're talking around roughly, give or take, a couple thousand years, right? And we're still waiting.
And it goes so quickly.
Relatively speaking, Any other thoughts there? Questions? Then you know where we're going, right? Go into that final question. That one that we've asked for every book. And by the way, when we get into New Testament, we'll be asking the same question again for each book. But this last final book of the Old Testament talks about preparing the way of the Lord, talks about the coming of the Lord for his first advent, also talks about his coming in the second advent. What is there in Malachi that would be for me in the day and age in which I live? Well, one of the things I remember and what I see is this. The kinds of sins that were being committed by the priests of Malachi's time are being committed by Christian leaders today. The complacency that can happen and take place. The loss of integrity. The teaching that would come out to say, God, you don't understand. He's not as bad as you make him out to be. This judgment stuff, that's not really God. Okay? We find the Christian leaders, not all of them, of course, but some are doing the exact same thing. Integrity is in question. Their message of God and his character and his nature is in question. Where they want to portray God as more of a good buddy who would understand rather than understanding that we have an account to make before him. Those kinds of things that the priests were doing during Malachi's time are some of the exact same things that are happening during our time in the Christian church. And it ought not to surprise us, because again, remember, just as the Christian leaders today, the priests of their day, we all are still dealing with the matters of the flesh, right? We are a sinful people. We have a sin nature. And so we battle, we struggle with that. And again, sometimes we get a little lost in the whole factor of how long has it been since God said anything distinctive? How long has it been since God has done anything significant, right? Those kinds of statements we would make. And that's why we do get complacent, just like the priests did in Malachi's time. Just as the priests learned in Malachi's time that God's word is God's word, and what he says he will do, he indeed will do. We need to have the same understanding. But I would rather have it be that we would have that understanding now, rather than after we have already seen what has gone on. So another interesting thing that we see in this book as well is the principle. And notice I've highlighted the word principle here. That's intentional, okay? Because I want to emphasize that word. The principle of tithes and offerings that he talks about in 3:8 is a principle that still applies for us today. We don't see it distinctly said necessarily in the New Testament where we talk about the tithe itself. But we do know that Paul, for example, is one who talks about the regular practice of putting or setting aside a certain amount on a weekly basis to give to the Lord's work. The tithes and the offerings. What was the principle there? These were things that were to be given to the Lord's work. This principle of understanding that the first 10% of that which I have actually is to be given to the Lord. And that is reserved for Him and Him alone. All right? That principle that is there still is reaffirmed for us in the New Testament. Just because we've gone into the New Testament does not change the fact that God is still the owner of all things, and I am the steward of what it is that He's given to me. So that principle of tithes and offerings that we are introduced to in Malachi still is a principle that applies to us today and reminds us today. Again, as God had put it in verse 8 of chapter 3, will a man rob God, yet you have robbed me? But you say, in what way have we robbed you? Tithes and offerings. When we get to that place in life where we are not taking that which we have and making sure that God is the one who receives back first, the principle there is clear. What we are doing is we are guilty of the same thing that the Israelites were in Malachi's time. Could he say to us, will a man rob God? And we would say, who? Me? And would God be able to say, yeah, you. And this is how it works. The things that you have, which I have given you, I do not have first dibs. And there's only one who can judge that, and that's God Himself, between our heart and His. But the principle still applies. Not only does the principle of tithes and offerings apply today, but even the principles of God's law still demand obedience. It's interesting that even though Malachi emphasizes the law and the obedience and the faithfulness to the law, even when we get into the New Testament, what we find is that the principles of God's laws that were introduced to us in the Old Testament, we find them reaffirmed for us, do we not, in the New Testament. And so this matter of faithfulness and obedience to the principles of God's laws still is an application to us. Just as Malachi tried to help the people of Israel as they were reestablished in the nation, as they were reestablished in the city, he was reminding them, he was trying to remind them, listen, even though it has been a number of years since that law was given, the principle of being obedient and faithful to what God wants us to do still applies today. And that's a principle that is good for us to be reminded of. In fact, we would say this, that the commands of Malachi about everyday living, and he has several of them in here, they are timeless. Not only are they good commands for the people of Israel to follow, but they are good commands for us to follow as well. And so we find that even with this last book of the Old Testament, where God says his final words before he turns silent for some 400 years, what he says here is applicable even for us today, and the principles that are shared. And so, with that little four-chapter book, we find that there are things even still for us today. The one advantage that we have, that the people of Malachi's day didn't, is that the message of God and what it is that he encourages us with does not end here, but it continues on as we would travel over into now what we call the New Testament. And again, we will be doing that in the new year. But in the meantime, let's thank God for what he has given us in the Old Testament. Why did we start talking about the Old Testament? Because you can't really get a good, full, solid grasp of the New Testament without understanding what's happening in the Old Testament. The New Testament is not an improvement of the Old Testament. What the New Testament is a continuation of God's plan of redemption for mankind that he began to talk about way back in Genesis. And the full significance and the fullness of what God's message is really comes to light now for us in the New Testament, because we have now the groundwork that we've already created with understanding the Old Testament. So let's thank God for the Old Testament. Let's not look upon the Old Testament as some ancient section of God's book that no longer applies to us. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Old Testament books still apply to us well today. The principles and the things that we find there are things that we need to continue to follow and continue to know. And so we will do that, and we will thank God for the Old Testament, and as well, we will thank God for the continuing story in the New Testament as we pick it up there in the new year. Let's pray. Thanks again, Father, for your goodness to us and the opportunity that we have had to understand a little more about the Old Testament. We thank you for it, for its principles, for its teachings. We thank you for its history, for the way in which it has shown us you, your nature, your character. Father, we haven't detailed absolutely everything that's here, but Father, this gives us a good beginning. It gives us a good start in the understanding of your word. And Father, as we have completed this, and then in a little while, when we begin the New Testament, Father, may we see that the things that we have learned and talked about in the Old Testament help us in our understanding of the New Testament as we begin its study. So thank you again for this time. Thank you for the books of the Old Testament. Continue to encourage and bless as we continue to study your word. And we will pray it in Jesus' name.